Inheritance meetings always pretend to be about love, history, and respect. People use soft voices and careful words, like they're handling something fragile. But anyone who's ever sat through one knows the truth. Under the polite smiles and folded hands, it's about ownership, about who mattered most, about who gets rewarded and who gets written out. That day felt no different when it started. The house was fuller than it had been in years. Relatives I hadn't seen since childhood showed up early, dressed nicer than usual, suddenly interested in family they barely checked on before. Conversations buzzed low and nervous, like everyone was waiting for a signal that it was okay to start measuring their future. My parents sat at the head of the long dining table, folders stacked neatly in front of them. My dad kept adjusting his glasses, flipping papers back and forth like order alone could keep emotions in check. My mom sat beside him, hands clasped, nodding occasionally, already exhausted by the tension she helped create by calling everyone together. My brother, though, looked relaxed. Too relaxed. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, legs stretched out like this was his living room and not a meeting about dividing a lifetime of property. He didn't bother hiding his confidence. He'd been walking around for weeks like the outcome was already locked in. I stayed quiet. I always did in rooms like this. Not because I was weak, but because I learned early that silence lets you see things others miss. It lets people show you who they think you are to them. And in my family, I had always been the afterthought. The responsible one. The one who didn't need help. The one who would be fine. When my dad finally cleared his throat, the room settled. Chairs scraped lightly. Someone turned off the TV in the other room. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. He started listing assets slowly, methodically. Accounts. Land. Properties. My brother barely paid attention. He nodded along, smiling at cousins, soaking in the looks of expectation aimed his way. He already felt like the winner. Then, before my dad could finish, my brother stood up. That alone should have told me everything. Let's not drag this out, he said, his tone smooth and practiced. Mom and Dad already decided. My dad looked surprised, but didn't stop him. That hesitation mattered more than anyone noticed. All 8 rental houses in Florida are coming to me, my brother continued, like he was announcing dessert after dinner. For a split second, there was silence. Then the reaction hit. Murmurs turned into applause. Someone laughed out loud. An aunt clapped her hands together like she was proud. Someone else cheered, actually cheered, as if this were a celebration and not a declaration that one sibling mattered more than the other. My brother turned toward me, enjoying the moment, enjoying the imbalance of power. He smiled, not kindly, but confidently, like this was the punchline he'd been waiting to deliver. Tegan, he said, dragging my name just a bit. Too bad. You're getting nothing. That was the moment everyone expected me to break. They expected shock, tears, anger, questions. Something loud enough to justify their silence, their approval, their clapping. I gave them none of it. I smiled. Not forced. Not bitter. Calm. Almost amused. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. Conversations died mid-breath. Someone frowned. My dad's eyes flicked to me, confused, unsettled. My mom shifted in her seat. I wasn't supposed to smile. I was supposed to feel small. That smile was the first crack in the story they'd all agreed on. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, and spoke in an even tone. Not raised. Not dramatic. Just clear. Dad, I said, meeting his eyes, you really don't know, do you? The room went silent so fast it felt physical, like the air had been pulled out. My brother laughed, but it came out wrong. Short. Uneasy. Know what? He expected me to bluff. To posture. To try and steal attention back. That's how he saw me. Someone who talked, not someone who prepared. But my dad didn't laugh. He froze. His hand tightened around the papers in front of him. His face strained just enough that I could see the realization forming before he said a word. That was when I knew. Whatever he had assumed, whatever he thought was settled, wasn't the whole picture. And in that moment, Standing in a room full of people who had already decided my worth, I understood something clearly for the first time. They thought this meeting was about dividing what already existed. They had no idea how much of the story they were missing. For them, this was the ending. For me, it was finally the beginning. People love clean stories, the kind that fit neatly into their expectations. In my family, the story had always been simple and comfortable for everyone else. My brother was the dependable one, the son who showed up, stayed close, laughed with the uncles, helped my dad carry chairs after dinner. I was the capable one, but from a distance. Useful, but not central. Present, but not essential. That narrative followed us everywhere. At holidays, relatives would ask him about his plans, his future, his ideas. When they spoke to me, it was always practical. Work questions. Advice requests. Can you look at this document? Can you explain this tax thing? Can you help us understand what we're signing? No one ever stopped to connect those dots. Years earlier, when my parents decided to invest in rental properties in Florida, it wasn't some grand, confident move. It was messy. They were excited, but also overwhelmed. Different state laws. Different tax implications. Property management contracts they didn't fully understand. LLC structures that sounded good in theory, but were confusing on paper. They tried asking my brother first. He brushed it off. Said it sounded boring. Said they should just hire someone. So they came to me. At the time, I was deep into real estate compliance work. Not the flashy side of property ownership, but the side that keeps people out of court. I knew how small mistakes could cost hundreds of thousands later. I knew how to structure ownership in ways that protected everyone involved. I knew what questions to ask before signing anything. I didn't swoop in dramatically. I didn't announce that I was saving them. I just helped. Quietly. Patiently. One document at a time. I reviewed purchase agreements. Flagged clauses that could cause trouble. Suggested changes to management contracts. Explained why certain properties should sit under different LLCs. When banks asked questions, I answered them. When tax advisors needed clarification, I handled it. At some point, it made sense for me to be listed formally. Not emotionally. Logically. I was already doing the work. Already managing the risk. Already responsible for making sure nothing blew up later. So my name went on paperwork. Not everywhere. Not loudly. But precisely where it mattered. Operating agreements. Management authority. Decision-making clauses. Structures that defined control, not inheritance. My parents trusted me because I never treated it like leverage. I didn't use it to gain status. I didn't bring it up at family dinners. I didn't correct anyone when they assumed my brother was more involved. I just kept things running. That's the part people don't understand about quiet competence. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just becomes part of the system, invisible until the system is tested. My brother never asked how the rentals stayed profitable year after year. Never questioned why issues were resolved quickly. Never wondered why my parents always said, Tegan's got it handled, with relief in their voices. To him, that phrase meant I was helping, not that I was embedded. So when he stood up in that inheritance meeting, confident and relaxed, he wasn't lying. He genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, the properties belonged to our parents and, by extension, to him. He assumed proximity equaled ownership. That being physically present meant being structurally important. He didn't know about the layers underneath. The agreements signed years earlier. The decisions made in quiet offices instead of loud living rooms. When I mentioned operating agreements and trusts, it wasn't a threat. It was a fact. I watched his face change as the room shifted. Not dramatically at first. Just small cracks. The way confidence drains when reality doesn't line up with assumptions. The relatives who had been cheering moments earlier leaned forward, curiosity replacing celebration. My parents looked between us, my dad especially, searching his memory. He wasn't confused because he didn't know. He was confused because he knew, but had never framed it this way before. In his mind, those structures were about protection, not favoritism. About stability, not division. He hadn't thought about how they would sound out loud, in a room full of people waiting to hear who won. That's the danger of meetings like that. They turn years of careful planning into a spectacle. They reduce responsibility to applause. My brother tried to regain control with questions, sharp and defensive. He wanted it to be a misunderstanding, a technicality, something that could be waved away with authority or volume. But it wasn't. This wasn't about who was loved more. It wasn't even about who deserved what. It was about who had done the work when no one was watching and who had mistaken silence for absence. As the conversation continued, I stayed calm. Not because I was enjoying the moment, but because there was nothing to prove. Everything I needed to say was already written down, signed, filed, and legally binding. The room had changed. The energy was no longer celebratory. It was attentive, serious. People were realizing they had misunderstood the story. And my brother, for the first time, was realizing that proximity without contribution doesn't equal control. That day wasn't about taking anything from him. It was about revealing something he never thought to look for. Not betrayal. Structure. Not a surprise attack. A quiet truth, finally spoken out loud. My brother shot up from his chair so fast it screeched across the floor, the sound slicing through the room and finally shattering that smug, celebratory mood everyone had been riding just seconds earlier. He looked stunned, like the ground had shifted under his feet and no one warned him. His face flushed red, then pale, cycling through emotions he wasn't used to handling in public. "That's not true," he said sharply, pointing at me like that alone could undo what I'd just said. "Dad, tell her. Tell her she's wrong." Every eye snapped to my father. And that's when the real shift happened. Because my dad didn't immediately defend him. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't shut me down. Instead, he lowered his gaze to the folder in front of him and started flipping pages, slowly, deliberately, like he was searching for something he suddenly realized he hadn't fully understood before. The room held its breath. Papers rustled. Someone coughed. A chair creaked as an aunt leaned forward. My brother's confidence started to crack in real time, and for the first time that day, he looked unsure of himself. I decided not to let the silence turn cruel. I wasn't there to humiliate him. I was there to correct a story that had been wrong for years. "Dad," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady, "do you remember when you were worried about liability? When you asked what would happen if one tenant sued and all 8 properties were tied together?" My mom's head snapped up before my dad could answer. I saw it in her eyes first, that flicker of recognition, like a memory finally locking into place. "You said it was safer this way," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "It was," I replied. "And it still is." My brother laughed, but it was thin and brittle. "Safer how?" he demanded. "What are you even talking about?" I took a breath, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted every word to land clearly. This wasn't a fight. It was a correction. The rentals aren't one big pile, I explained. They're split across multiple LLCs. 3 are managed directly by entities I oversee. 2 are held in a family trust, with me as the trustee. The remaining ones are joint managed, not solely owned by any one person. The effect was immediate. It was like someone had turned the volume down on the entire room. No more murmurs. No more side conversations. Just stunned silence. My brother stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. "That's impossible," he said. "You can't just do that." "I didn't just do it," I said evenly. "Mom and Dad signed everything. With attorneys. Years ago." My dad finally looked up, his expression tight, conflicted, but not confused. "That told me everything." He remembered. He just hadn't thought about it in the way my brother had assumed. That's when panic set in. My brother's voice rose, sharp and frantic. He accused me of being sneaky, of manipulating our parents, of planning this behind his back. Words like unfair and underhanded flew around the room, bouncing off the walls, aimed at me like they could force me into guilt. I didn't raise my voice to match his. "Nothing was stolen," I said, calmly enough that a few people turned back toward me instead of him. "You just never bothered to understand how it worked." That line hit harder than anything else. Because it was true. He had always assumed proximity meant ownership. That being present meant being in control. That because he showed up for dinners and holidays, he automatically knew everything that mattered. He never asked about the paperwork, never asked how income flowed, never questioned why my parents always said, "Tegan's handling it." He just assumed that handling meant admin work, busy work, nothing important. Now the room was buzzing again, but the tone had changed. No cheers, no applause, just questions, confusion. People whispering to each other, recalculating what they thought they knew. An uncle leaned over to his wife. A cousin frowned at the paperwork. Someone quietly asked my mom when all this had been set up. And my brother? He was unraveling. The confidence he'd walked in with, the kind that comes from half information and full entitlement, was gone. In its place was raw frustration. Because for the first time, he was realizing that the story he'd been telling himself didn't line up with reality. He wasn't the sole heir. He wasn't the only trusted one. And he definitely wasn't the only person who mattered in that room. I watched him stand there, hands clenched, eyes darting between my parents and me, trying to find solid ground again. But there was none left. Not because I took it from him, but because it had never really been his to begin with. That was the moment everyone understood something important. This wasn't about favoritism. It was about involvement. And confidence without information? It's just noise. The moment didn't explode the way people expect moments like that to. There was no shouting match, no dramatic walkout, no slammed doors. What followed was quieter, heavier, and far more uncomfortable for everyone involved. The kind of silence that settles in when people realize the story they were celebrating a few minutes ago was never real. When my brother stood up and accused me, it wasn't just anger in his voice. It was fear. The kind that shows up when control slips through your fingers and you don't know how to grab it back. He needed someone to blame, and I was the closest target. But even as he spoke, the room had already shifted away from him. My parents didn't jump to his defense. That alone was new. My dad's hands shook as he flipped through the folder, not because he didn't remember what he'd signed, but because he finally understood the weight of it. He wasn't losing anything. He was realizing how much responsibility he'd already placed on me without ever saying it out loud. When my mom whispered that she remembered, it wasn't an accusation. It was a confession. A quiet acknowledgement that she'd trusted me more than she'd ever admitted, even to herself. That realization hit harder than any argument could have. For years, I'd done the work in the background, not because I wanted control, but because someone needed to make sure things didn't fall apart. My brother couldn't process that. In his mind, ownership was loud. It was titles and announcements and being seen as the chosen one. He had mistaken proximity for authority, presence for involvement. He'd been there for dinners and holidays, and he thought that was enough. Meanwhile, the actual work had been happening in emails, contracts, meetings with lawyers, and long phone calls about risk and protection. As questions started bouncing around the room, people began connecting dots they'd never bothered to look at before. Why had the rentals always run smoothly? Why had there never been a major tax issue? Why did my parents always say, "It's handled," without explaining how? The answer had been right there the whole time, just not packaged in a way that demanded attention. My brother's panic escalated because he realized this wasn't a technicality he could argue away. This wasn't something he could outtalk or outmaneuver. Everything had been done cleanly, legally, with full consent. The system didn't bend just because he expected it to. For the first time, confidence failed him because it wasn't backed by understanding. The accusations he threw at me were really admissions of his own neglect. He'd never asked questions, never learned the structure, never wanted the responsibility, only the reward. And now that the reward wasn't guaranteed, he was scrambling to rewrite the story in his favor. I stayed calm, not because I enjoyed watching him unravel, but because there was nothing left to prove. The truth didn't require volume. It stood on its own. Every document, every signature, every agreement told the same story, one he'd chosen not to read. Around us, the relatives who had cheered earlier grew quiet. They shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of how quickly they'd celebrated something they didn't understand. Their excitement had been built on assumption, and assumptions collapse fast when facts show up. What made the moment powerful wasn't that I corrected my brother. It was that everyone saw, in real time, the cost of entitlement without effort. They saw that being loud doesn't make you right, and being quiet doesn't mean you're absent. By the time my brother sat back down, staring at the table like it had betrayed him, the reality had fully settled. He hadn't been tricked. He hadn't been robbed. He had simply overlooked the work that didn't announce itself. And in that realization, something fundamental broke. Not the inheritance, the illusion, because ownership isn't declared. It's earned. And that day, in that room, he finally understood the difference. That meeting didn't just rearrange numbers on paper. It rearranged how everyone in that room saw me, and more importantly, how I saw myself walking out of it. When people say money changes things, they're usually wrong. Money doesn't change people. It exposes what was already there. That day, what got exposed wasn't greed or generosity. It was assumption. Years and years of it, stacked quietly on my shoulders while no one bothered to look closely. I'd spent most of my adult life being underestimated in rooms like that. Not openly dismissed, not insulted to my face, just quietly overlooked. I was the one who listened more than I spoke. The one who handled things behind the scenes. The one whose work only got noticed when it wasn't done. In my family, loudness had always been confused with leadership, and proximity had been mistaken for contribution. My brother showed up, smiled, stayed visible. I stayed useful. And usefulness, when it's quiet, has a funny way of disappearing from people's memories. As I walked out of that inheritance meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. Conversations behind me sounded different. Softer. Less confident. People who had been clapping earlier now avoided eye contact, suddenly busy with their phones or whispering in corners. The same relatives who had cheered when my brother announced I was getting nothing now looked uncomfortable sitting with the realization that they'd celebrated a story that wasn't true. That mattered more than any apology would have. Because apologies would have still framed me as the wronged one, the victim who deserved sympathy. What happened instead reframed me as something else entirely. Someone informed. Someone capable. Someone who hadn't just reacted to circumstances, but shaped them long before anyone noticed. My parents felt it too. On the drive home later that evening, my mom was quiet in a way she rarely was. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Thoughtful. The kind of quiet that comes when someone realizes they haven't been paying attention. My dad didn't try to smooth things over with jokes or explanations. He asked questions instead. Specific ones. About timelines. About decisions they'd made years ago without really understanding their full impact. That was new. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself to be accepted. I was being consulted because my input mattered. My brother, on the other hand, retreated. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just slowly. He stopped calling as often. Stopped making assumptions about plans or outcomes. In group conversations, he listened more than he spoke. Not because he suddenly respected me, but because the ground under his certainty had cracked. He'd built his confidence on the idea that he knew how everything worked. That belief didn't survive contact with reality. What struck me most was that none of this required me to raise my voice, defend my worth, or demand recognition. I didn't have to point fingers or recount every late night spent reviewing contracts, every problem solved quietly before it became visible. I didn't need to say, "Look what I've done." The structure itself said it for me. That's a powerful lesson, one I wish I'd learned earlier. So many people think respect comes from being seen struggling or fighting, from making noise, from insisting others acknowledge your effort. But real respect often comes from preparedness, from competence that doesn't need an audience, from being so grounded in what you know that you don't need validation when challenged. That meeting taught my family something they weren't expecting to learn. That the person they'd mentally placed in the background had been carrying more weight than anyone realized. That silence isn't absence. And that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one doing the work. It taught me something too. I realized I didn't feel angry. Not then. Not afterward. What I felt was relief. Relief that I no longer had to wonder whether my contributions mattered. Relief that the story I'd been quietly living finally matched the reality on paper. Relief that I could stop bracing myself for dismissal because it no longer fit the facts. The biggest change came in the weeks that followed. Family conversations shifted. When financial topics came up, people asked instead of assumed. When decisions were discussed, I was included early, not as an afterthought. Even relatives who barely acknowledged me before now treated me with a cautious respect, the kind that comes when people realize they misjudged someone and don't want to do it again. I didn't correct them. I didn't lean into it. I let it be, because confidence doesn't need reinforcement once it's earned. Looking back, I understand why my smile at that table confused everyone. They expected shock, pain, maybe a fight. Smiles don't make sense when people think they're watching someone lose. But I wasn't losing. I was standing exactly where I'd been standing all along, just finally seen clearly. That smile wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about certainty. About knowing the ground under my feet was solid, no matter what anyone else believed. The inheritance meeting wasn't the climax of my story. It was the reveal. The moment when quiet effort met public awareness. And once that happens, there's no going back to being invisible. I walked away calm because I didn't need to carry anyone's assumptions anymore. They were free to rewrite their narratives. I already knew mine, and that made all the difference. Before you go, take a second. If this story made you pause, think, or see things differently, hit like so more people find it. If you enjoy real stories with quiet power, twists, and truth people don't expect, subscribe to Secret Twist Stories. And drop a comment. I read them and I want to know what you would have done in this situation. More stories like this are coming. You won't want to miss the next one.